Hello, I'm John. Welcome back. So I've got a few books to share with you today. They're all nonfiction, and these are books that I've read over the past couple of weeks. And I read quite a bit of fiction also, but I've decided to split them into two separate videos just to lighten the load on me, I guess, and make sure that the videos are short or relatively short so that, they're not super long. And I know it's hard to watch long videos from personal experience. And so anyway, I'll just jump right into it. The first one I read was Red Star Rogue by Kenneth Sewell with Clint Richmond, the untold story of a Soviet submarine's nuclear strike attempt on the U.S. And so I knew what I was getting myself into when I started this because I read one of the follow-up books they wrote, which I think was called Scorpion Down, about the sinking of USS Scorpion. I think they've read or written a couple of books, so I think that's the one that I read. And that was supposedly caused by this incident here, where so basically you take yourself back to 1968. Leonid Brezhnev is the Soviet premier, and some people in the upper echelons of the Soviet government are pretty unhappy with him for some. They think he's showing weakness, that he is changing, undermining Soviet communism and allowing the West to win. So the authors speculate that like a shadowy figure named Suslov, who was not part of the Politburo but was always on the outskirts. He was an incredibly dangerous man, apparently. He'd been there since the beginning, or near the beginning, of the Communist Revolution. And the other person in on this was Yuri Andropov, who was the head of the KGB and would later be Soviet premier himself. And the idea is that they came up with this big plot where they would use a Soviet submarine, a Soviet ballistic missile sub, to launch a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and make it look like the Chinese government was responsible to start a war between the United States and the Chinese government. So the Soviets had given the Chinese a couple of Gulf-class submarines, or maybe one or two, something like that. And it was an older style sub, a little bit older, as a diesel electric. And so this cabal at the higher levels of government decided to use one of the Soviet Gulf class subs to mimic the launch process of the submarines they had given to the Chinese, because the relations between the Chinese communists and the Soviets had deteriorated to the point where they were almost on the verge of war, or so it seems. I'm not really sure about that period of, Soviet-Chinese relations myself. That's what the authors said. And so to do that, they would have to put the boat on a certain latitude and longitude. There were these certain steps that an older boat had to go through. It had to be within so many miles of its target. It had to be at a precise latitude and longitude, and it had to be on the surface, etc., etc. And they thought that by doing this, by mimicking the procedure the Chinese would have to use, the United States government would think it was the Chinese and attack China. And the way they went about doing this, they put a 15-man KGB squad on the sub, undercover as sailors. The KGB team took over the ship, well, they're always called boats. Submarines are always called boats. They took over the boat and they went through this procedure. They had all the codes apparently, and the only thing that saved Pearl Harbor was that when they launched the missile, they had neglected to overcome the failsafe in the warhead. The warhead detonated, sank the ship, sank the boat. It's hard to remember that distinction, but it sank the boat and foiled this plot, basically. That is the speculation of the authors based on interviews and hearsay evidence that is pretty much unverifiable. And also they go on to talk about how Richard Nixon wanted to raise K-129 from the bottom of the sea. So they found it with USS Halibut, and then they used a ship, a specially built ship by, I think it was the Hughes Corporation or one of their satellites, to build this giant ship, looked kind of like an oil rig, but its purpose was to raise K-129 from the bottom of the sea, called the Glomar Explorer. That was pretty interesting. Now, the government said that they only brought up part of K-129 and the rest fell back to the ocean and they couldn't recover it because it burst into pieces. And the authors claim that they spoke with people who said it was brought all the way to the surface, that the entire sub was brought to the surface and salvaged, and that the people they spoke with said that the computers and everything on board said that there was a launch and that it was targeting Pearl Harbor. So like I said, all of this is from hearsay evidence of unnamed, unverifiable sources and speculation built on that, and speculation treated as fact and built on in that way to say that certain things happened in the U.S. government and in the Soviet government because of this incident, because I think Gerald Ford used this evidence to put pressure on Leonid Brezhnev and etc. Like I said, it's all built on speculation. None of it is verifiable. These things are classified. They've never been brought out, at least as far as when this book was written, which was about 20 years ago. But I think they're still classified now. So we don't know the true story. And these authors didn't know the true story. They were listening to people who may have been telling them lies and fabrications, and they treated it as fact and speculated about that. So it's an interesting story. It's a exciting story, but it's pretty much fantasy based on hearsay. So, it's just an interesting what if, really, but they treat it as fact, and that's kind of bothersome. If you didn't know that, that could be, that could be misleading. So anyway, that is Red Star Rogue by Kenneth Sewell with Clint Richmond. So the next book I read was Philip Caputo's The Longest Road, Overland in Search of America from Key West to the Arctic Ocean. So in the 90s, Caputo was on a hunting trip to Alaska, and he got it in his head that it would be interesting to take a trip from the furthest 2 points of the U.S., which would be from Key West to Dead Horse, Alaska. And that kind of sat dormant in his head for a while, and then about 15 years ago, he went ahead and did this trip. And, Caputo is a Vietnam veteran. He wrote A Rumor of War, which I've read, and there are some parts in that book that even if you forget the rest, you won't forget certain things about it. Like, I remember specifically how he talked about the first time he was ever shot at. There were some VC over in a tree line across a rice paddy. They were shooting at him, and all he could see were flashes, and he just kind of stood there looking at this like they're shooting at me. That's an interesting scene, or an interesting memory he had. But anyway, that's not the point of this. The point of this is he starts getting things together. He leases an Airstream camper, buys a truck, and then he and his wife and their 2 dogs go cross country. And he wants to ask people, in the political climate of, I think, 2010, something like that, 2010, 2011, what it is that holds the United States together, all these different groups of people, what keeps us together. I thought that was an interesting premise, but it kind of sits on the back burner for most of the book, and excluding a couple of conversations he had with people, nothing they say is really all that profound. And the interesting parts of this book were really just the travel narrative aspects. But ultimately, it was just kind of middle of the road. Nothing really stood out to me. I've read quite a few travelogues, and I wanted more from this book. I wanted more from the premise, the asking people what keeps the United States together. And ultimately, road trips aren't all that exciting unless, exciting things happen. And it was good. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking badly about this book or anything like that. It's just, I just wanted more from both parts. I wanted more from the travelogue. I wanted more from the inquiry into the state of the United States, I guess. And I thought it was still pretty good. I thought it was written pretty well. I don't know. It was just kind of middle of the road to me. And I mean no disrespect to Philip Caputo for that. So the next book I read was the Valachi Papers by Peter Maas. And there he is. This is from 1968. This is not a first edition, but it's pretty close. And so the Valachi Papers is, well, so there was a soldier in the Genovese family in the early 60s. He was an older guy. I think he was in his 50s by this time. And he went to prison, and his friends basically started to think he was a rat. So they started to shun him and insult him, and he knew that he was going to be killed in this prison. So one day he picked up a pipe and he killed somebody. And he killed the wrong person who had nothing to do with it. He was just paranoid and scared, and he killed the wrong person who sort of looked like somebody else. And so Valachi decided to cooperate with the government, and he was the first person really to go in depth about Cosa Nostra, about the American Mafia. And it's a really interesting story because Valachi had been there from the beginning, from the time when the Black Hand became Cosa Nostra. There was something called the Castellammaris War in the 20s, where there was one man trying to become the boss of bosses of New York. His name was Joe Masseria, Big Joe Masseria, and on the other side was Sal Maranzano. And so they were engaged in this war. I mean, they really were shooting each other in the streets. They were setting up machine gun nests and shooting out of windows and things like that. I mean, it was a big deal. And Valachi was allied with Sal Maranzano, and Valachi had been a burglar, a getaway driver. He'd been a getaway driver for some armed robbers for a while. He was sent to Sing Sing prison, and he got out. He met up with some other people, and he was sent back to Sing Sing. And one of his gang members was electrocuted during that period of time. He got out. There's this big war going on. He allies with Sal Maranzano, and I hope I have their names straight. It's been a little while since I've read this, so forgive me if I have their names wrong. And there were fewer of them, so they were fighting a larger force. But Maranzano was able to frighten some of Masseria's allies into turning against him, and including Carlo Gambino and Lucky Luciano. And they betrayed Joe Masseria. He was killed. Sal Maranzano took over as boss of bosses. He set up the five family system in New York. And he got kind of paranoid, and Lucky Luciano took him out and took Valachi into the fold. And he talks about, so basically, he was there for almost 30 years of, well, probably more than 30 years of this history between, the buildup of the American Mafia, the creation of the five families, the wars in between them. And he was basically a racketeer. He was running numbers. He was getting involved in loan sharking, and he was a money maker, basically. And he was kind of a low-level guy overall, but when you think of a soldier in the Mafia, you can't think of them the same as like a soldier in the army. It's not really the same. They are on the inside. They are part of this organization. They are high up, regardless of really where they're situated. I mean, there are hierarchies within it, but they run their own scams. They do their own business. They're involved with who knows how many people. They answer to a capo. Capo answers to the underboss and the boss. So he was a bigger deal than just a regular street criminal, but he wasn't in the higher echelons of this, except that he was friends with, or close to, Sal Maranzano and Vito Genovese and Lucky Luciano. So those are all big names, and very powerful people, very dangerous people. And yeah, it's just an interesting look about what was going on, what they talked about, how they spoke to each other, what their rules were, And it was a little bit hard to follow at times because Valachi didn't write the book. What happened was he wrote 1,600 pages, and the government decided that they wouldn't allow him to publish his book. And Peter Maas had been talking to him, Peter Maas, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, had been talking to Valachi in interviews. And so he used his interviews to write this book after Valachi's book had been banned, basically. And there were laws and everything, but they had said they were going to allow it to be published, and then they went back on their deal with Valachi and with Maas. And so when Valachi would speak about these things, sometimes his stories were a little bit hard to follow because he was so entrenched in that life that what's obvious to him would not be obvious to us. And so I was kind of left out a few times, but he had a remarkable memory for numbers, for phone numbers, for how much money he made on what date and what happened when. And Maas goes back and verifies some of these things and says, well, Valachi was right about this and this and this and this. He remembered all this stuff verbatim. And it was just a really interesting book. And I think, let's see, Valachi died later on after this. I think he had a heart attack and died, something like that. He was a heavy smoker and everything. And yeah, it was just really interesting. It's a really interesting part of that whole history. Without Valachi, we might not have known some of those things about the Castellammaris War, about the beginning of the Mafia, about the founding of the 5 families. So just interesting. I enjoyed that. I read it in a couple of days. And that brings us to the end of this particular video. So I hope that's not too long. I tried to cut it short. And I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.